Have you ever worked with a difficult colleague? Of course you have. We all have. From passive-aggressive colleagues to the person who always plays the victim, right through to the insecure boss. Amy Gallo has written the book on the 8 difficult types of coworker, but she also explains why conflict is not a bad thing and how it can drive an organisation forward. Her day job is a contributing editor at Harvard Business Review, where she writes about interpersonal dynamics, communicating ideas and building your career. In this episode of Jimmy's Jobs of the Future, she talks us through why the most worrying thing in your business can be if there's no conflict at all.
I'm often brought into organizations because there's not enough disagreement.
Well, Amy, welcome to Jimmy's Jobs of the Future.
Thank you for having me.
So you're over in the UK promoting a book. Tell us what the book's about.
Sure. It's called Getting Along, How to Work with Anyone, Even Difficult People. And it came out actually in 2022, but the paperback just released in the UK and Europe. And it's about how to get along better with people at work, in particular, the people who challenge you, push your buttons, all of that. And there are lots of books out there on dealing with difficult people. What I wanted to do differently with this book was I knew that there was research and evidence that showed how you dealt with someone who was a pessimist would be different than how you dealt with someone who was a know-it-all, for example. So I came up with 8 archetypes of difficult people, not a mutually exclusive list. Someone can be on many of those. Someone might defy all of them and be their own special category of difficultness. And then give evidence-based strategies for trying to at least neutralize the relationship or the dynamic between you, but ideally actually improve it.
And which were the first ones that made the list? Which ones did you think were the most important?
You'll not be surprised. The very first archetype, it's the very first chapter I wrote. It's the very first one when everyone said, oh, you're writing this book, you have to include this, was the passive-aggressive peer. And passive-aggressive behavior just seems to be rampant, at least in U.S. organizations, but I'm finding around the world too, as I do speaking and in workshops. So that was really the first one. The other one was the know-it-all.
Yeah.
I think there's just a lot of arrogance, and we can talk a little bit why I think that one shows up a lot, but it is a very common one. People often call it the mansplainer. I think a lot of people associate it with a gender dynamic. There is certainly that element, but I honestly identify as a know-it-all, so I think it also defies gender as well.
I'm so glad that you identified as a know-it-all, because when I was reading through, it definitely was like a critical self-assessment in terms of like, there's definitely bits of me that I can see in almost all of the traits, not quite every single one, but it is really interesting. So why do you think the passive-aggressive one came out?
I think actually my first book is the HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict. So I've been writing about, thinking about, talking about conflict in organizations and on teams for, 7+ years now. And you would think as a conflict expert, I'd be brought into organizations where there's all-out brawls, there's drama, there's fighting. But it's the exact opposite, which I'm often brought into organizations because there's not enough disagreement. Leaders are saying, I'm not hearing from people. I know they have ideas. No one will speak up. We had this big scandal and no one said anything about it until, it was too late. And I think there's this tendency in organizations, I think it's probably gotten worse. I don't have the data or evidence, but I have a theory that it's gotten worse in the last 10 years to really avoid conflict. It's as if in some teams saying, I disagree is the same as saying, I hate you.
Yeah.
And people just see it as this sort of rupture in the harmony we expect with other people.
Because that was one of the interesting ones. I imagine this was pretty high up on people's lists as well. It's the first one you talk about in the book, the insecure boss.
That's right.
Because that sort of, and in that I thought is one of the things that can really kill an organization is the lack of decision-making ability,
Yes.
right? And that's partly conflict avoidance as well, right?
Absolutely. And I think because of conflict avoidance, we see passive-aggressive behavior, right? People saying things, or not saying things, but finding indirect ways to say things that they should be able to just say directly.
Yeah.
So they communicate through their body language or through snarky comments or through their behavior. The insecure manager is similar, right? The lack of decision-making. The other piece of the insecure manager I think is really problematic and is connected to conflict is that they're not interested in hearing people's voices, right? There's actually lots of studies that show the larger the gap between a leader's felt competence, so how good they believe at their job, and the expectation of how they will perform, the less likely they want to hear what's called in the academic literature employee voice, which basically means they don't want to hear what you have to say. And so
Yeah.
they end up indirectly silencing people. And that creates this sort of artificial harmony, which is what Patrick Lencioni calls it, or this passive aggressive behavior, this lack of decision making, lack of direction, lack of strategy.
And what's your advice kind of for bosses in it? Because one of the things that I really struck with myself when reading it was the pessimist. Now, I would ultimately think of myself as a very positive person, etc. But I actually thought, like, particularly working with younger people, it can be a bit of a challenge sometimes, because one of the great things of running a podcast is the session that we go through every month where we go through guest ideas and like how we're going to reach out to guests and so on. And like lots of young, ambitious people will have such great ideas. And I just sit there and think, that is so unlikely to come off. I'd love Tom Hanks to come on podcasts, but
Right.
I think it's pretty unlikely. But it's hard because it's like, you don't want to be that pessimist,
No,
right? Like you want to encourage it, but how do you how do you handle that?
I so relate to that. You don't want to have been like, done that, couldn't do that, impossible, right?
Exactly.
Right? Like you just want to tick through the ideas. And I mean, I see this with my daughter too. She's 17. She has ambitions that I have to be very careful to bite my tongue and be like, yeah, that's not good. Right?
Yeah.
But thank God they're doing that, right? Thank God they're dreaming big. Thank God they're pushing to us. And I really try in my own sort of interactions, especially with younger colleagues, to say, okay, wait, why do I think that wouldn't happen? Why do I think Tom Hanks wouldn't come on? What if we just emailed Tom Hanks' PR person? Who knows, right? Like, and then try to just sort of indulge is too condescending of a word, but sort of join in the optimism for a moment, and just imagine what would be possible.
Yeah.
And some of the advice for dealing with someone who is a pessimist is to engage in their thinking. So if they say that will never work, say, well, what would it take to make it work, right? Or what would be one thing we could do that would increase the chances it could work, right? To start to engage them in their thinking. And if I do that reverse psychology on myself, right, I have to ask myself the same questions. What would it take to make this work? I have to ask you though, because you talked about the insecure manager, you talked about the pessimist. Are those two you identify with?
Yes. Definitely the skill boss in terms of like when you're running your own thing, like there is like a lot that you just don't know. And it's only the further you get into it that you realize it's not. But I think I found it so acute with the pessimist one because I think pessimism and victimhood, which is number 3, are like two I just can't stand. Right? Like if people have got those kind of like mindsets, I think personally it's just not going to work. And so then I was sitting there thinking, but you are quite pessimistic. So like, so it's kind of like, and that's the one trait you don't want. So.
Well, and I found this to be a pattern is that people, when I often ask in some of my talks, what's one archetype that you find most difficult to deal with? And then I'll ask, okay, which one do you identify most with? Meaning you actually exhibit those behaviors, and they're often the same. So, right, because of course, and it's the same. I identify as a know-it-all. That chapter I wrote through, like, I would just cringe the entire time. But I hate know-it-allness in someone else. It drives me bonkers.
Do you know what's quite interesting was thinking back to my time in Downing Street, and one of the questions that my friends asked me a month after being there, all very excited, interested to know what it was like. And one of them said, is there a lot of cleverest person in the room syndrome? So the know-it-all syndrome. And I was like, there's actually not so much of that, but there is quite a lot of, let me show you what can go wrong with that idea. And so kind of a bit of the pessimist thing, which I just thought was interesting because there was a lot of sort of covering backs mentality, etc. And at times, quite often, one of my learnings in number 10, government more generally, was like, at some point, somebody just says, we're going to do this, we're going to take the risk and so on. It is a very risk-averse culture, government. And it just kind of really struck with me when I was reading through those in terms of.
Well, and there's science to show why that sort of contrarian viewpoint is so common in those cultures, because there's a professor named Eileen Chow at the University of Virginia who looked at the power that we afford someone with a contrarian perspective. So let's say you're in a room, 10 Downing Street, people are talking, they're coalescing around an idea. This sounds good. Let's move forward. And someone says, oh, wait, let me tell you everything that could go wrong.
Yeah.
They now have all the power in the room because they've expressed a perspective that's different. We now are giving them 90% of our attention as opposed to an equal amount of our attention compared with everyone else. So there's actually research that shows why someone would do that. And often when I am coaching people or helping people who are dealing with a pessimist and they say, why are they doing this? And I think, well, they probably feel powerless, or they're trying to show that they have some authority, and it's a actually quick shortcut to gain that power. So I'm not surprised to see it happening in those rooms.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that actually, and it's quite a sort of, think about it, it's a bit of an easier thing to do as a junior person. Not an easier thing, but it's an easy way to add to the conversation about something, to sort of like spot the kind of like problems and whatever. And you also, like, rightly don't think you won't get so much blowback from it.
That's
right.
We call it in the US CYA, cover your ass, right? Is that like you?
I was going to say that, but I know American.
Right. And it's because if you say this won't work, when it doesn't work, you're all set, right?
Yeah.
But if it does work, you go, oh, it was, like it's a way to just sort of make sure you're covering all your bases.
Yeah. Another one that was interesting, the passive aggressive one is interesting, sort of just like on the number 10 theme a bit as well, because it's quite like a sort of fast-paced environment to work in. It is, you are very kind of like short with people. And sometimes I think now when I'm, not in that world, that sometimes I can sort of be the, you talk about the fine whatever type thing. I don't, the whatever like does a lot there, doesn't it? Because I'm often very like short with things. And it's one of the things as well with like the guys going back to the guest outreach and so on, is like they write these great emails, but you need to get to the point like really quick. And so I just thought it's a fine balance with that, because, quite often I was telling the team this morning, like, we didn't really talk about our weekends at Downing Street and so on. Like, and there wasn't that much of that sort of like softer side of it. Like, it was just sort of straight into it and so on. So
just get down to business.
Completely.
Yeah. I think, I don't know if this is true in the UK, but I feel like passive aggressive has also become this sort of catch-all phrase for behavior we don't like. Right? Like, it's just like, oh, they're passive aggressive, And the truth is, no one thinks they're passive aggressive. No one goes home at the end of the day and says, wow, I was so passive aggressive at work today. Right? They might think I was petty, or, oh, I was indirect, or, but they don't think they're passive aggressive. So I think I really wanted to define it clearly in that chapter so that we could be more precise about what we mean.
Yeah.
Not asking about someone's weekend, saying fine, whatever. Like, that could be quite just aggressive. It's the passive aggressive when you mean, actually, I really don't like what you're saying, or I don't agree with this strategy, or no, I'm not going to do that, but I'm not going to say it. I'm just going to actually not do it later on. That is the real passive aggressive behavior that I think is really challenging to deal with.
Yeah. And talk to us about the tormentor as well. Explain that one.
Yeah. So the tormentor, this was a chapter. Oh, I rewrote this chapter so many times. It's so painful to think about. But it was originally actually about the queen bee syndrome, which is this phenomenon that people talk about of senior women in an organization mistreating younger women who are coming up in the organization, questioning their commitment to work, assigning them unnecessary tasks, just sort of undermining them. And there's a lot of controversy about that term queen bee and about the phenomenon itself. There are people who study it. A woman in the Netherlands named Belle Dirks who has done a lot of research on it. And it's the difficulty with it is that the perception of it and the actual phenomenon are laden with gender bias, right? We expect women to care about other women. So when they don't, which actually might quite be normal or expected, then they get punished for doing it. And there are people who do that, men who do that, and anyone of any gender could do that, and we don't slap a label on them.
Yeah.
So I really tried to find another term for it, because even the people I interviewed for the chapter would say, it was a woman, but it could have been it could have been anyone, and it's happened to me with a man, and so I actually went on LinkedIn and described the behavior and asked people, what would you call this? And this guy, Mike Gutman, wrote back and said, I call it the tormentor because they're someone you expect to be a mentor, but they actually do the exact opposite. So that's where the tormentor term came from. And Mike Gutman gets credit for it in that chapter. But it's really about someone who you maybe is more senior than you in the organization. Perhaps you have some sort of shared identity or shared background. So you expect them to look out for you, maybe even sponsor you, but they just actually make your life miserable. And that's, I mean, I think I've yet to meet someone who hasn't worked with someone like that. Have you?
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, obviously, it's a sort of it's a bit of a generational breakdown.
Yes.
But I do think, particularly, with Gen Z being, kind of much more alive to work-life balance and all this type of thing, I find as a sort of middling millennial that you end up kind of being the bridge sometimes between these things of like, well, they have got a point on some of the stuff. But then, they'll say, well, I've got a yoga appointment at 3:00. And you're like, right, no, that's too far. Like so you kind of, there's this sort of like an interesting kind of balance. And actually it's not very helpful to say, this was like it was in my day, you should do the same. But then at the same time, people have to work hard. And when you're young, you have to make the most of whatever your attributes are at the time. And one of the things when you're young is you have less commitments elsewhere, and you have the advantage of having time, and you can use that time to make up for knowledge. Is the way that I try and explain it to the team, and so on.
That's an interesting way to describe it. Yeah, I mean, there's the people who research generational differences. Some of them call it the kids these days effect, right? Oh, kids these days, they have yoga appointments at 3 p.m. They don't understand commitment, and they're all entitled. And the truth is, when we were that age, we also were entitled. But we don't remember it that way because we saw ourselves. We thought we were working hard. I mean, we were working hard, but we saw ourselves differently than people ahead of us saw. So I try to remind myself of that too as a Gen Xer of like, it can be really easy to judge millennials, Gen Z, even boomers. But I'm like, okay, wait, I'm going to be like that in 10 years. I was like that 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And sure, there are actual generational differences, especially with technology, world events that happen during those time periods. But I think those differences are less acute than we make them out to be.
Yeah.
And I think the tormentor, it's the chapter that I interviewed people for. The most people I interviewed for in that chapter where the result of the trying to deal with that archetype was that they quit. And I think it's a really hard one. When someone has that much power, the tormenting behavior really takes a toll too on your sort of self-esteem and your self-confidence. I can see why people leave a job when they're dealing with someone who behaves that way. But I also think some of the tactics that have been shown to be effective, things like empathizing with them, right? Like, you had it much harder than I do. I mean, I can see how you would be resentful of our generation and how easy we have it, right? Just empathizing with them tends to take some of the heat out of those interactions. And then also, to your point about knowledge, making up for work, time with knowledge, is that you can also show them you have something that they need, whether that's time to work really hard on a project, or maybe you do have some sort of special knowledge or access to a relationship. If you can change that power dynamic just a little bit with a tormentor, they do tend to treat you a little bit better.
Yeah. That empathy in going both ways is very interesting. Because I've often like there's I always think the best bosses that I've had have definitely annoyed me at points. But like they've kind of annoyed me for the right reasons. Like, and once I sort of step back from it, I appreciate that. And so on. And like when you're in the midst of it and you feel like you're working hard and you're not perhaps getting that empathy or that kind of recognition, at least for doing that.
Yeah.
It can be quite hard. But good bosses should push you and make you feel kind of uncomfortable, etc. And it's
and the nicest bosses I had were not the best bosses I had.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think we forget that and especially nowadays, I think I have such sympathy for middle managers in particular, but managers in general. There's this pressure to not only, get people to produce work, meet your targets, do all of the stuff they've always had to do, but now there's this huge expectation that they care emotionally for their
Yeah.
team. And I think that's a good thing, don't get me wrong, but it's the burden on managers to do that is huge. And so I try to remind managers, it's about being respected. It's not about being liked, because if you put in so much effort to get everyone to like you, you're going to fail in the other aspects of your job.
But it is interesting, that sort of development of like, bring your whole self to work, etc., and so on. And I do sometimes think that people might not want to bring their whole self to work. It's really tricky on a lot of this stuff. There's some sort of talk about what potential Labour government might bring in later in the year, and like one of the questions that supposedly we should think about as employers asking people is whether they were brought up in a single parent household or whether they were on free school meals. And I just feel very like, I don't feel I should be asking that as kind of like interview questions, because actually you're sort of in danger of bringing in, reinforcing biases, etc.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just think all this stuff is incredibly interesting.
That's the question you're meant to ask, because why?
So you can assess people's social backgrounds and see how kind of like socially diverse and how much social mobility there is coming through.
Right. So interesting, because it is in the US. Actually, I don't say this with 100% confidence, but as a know-it-all, I'll say it anyway. But which is that I think that would be illegal in the US, right?
Yeah.
Because we're really careful not to ask questions that would introduce bias.
Exactly.
Right. It's such a tricky line around the bring the whole self to work. There's a great writer named Jodi Ann Burry. She's written for Harvard Business Review a few times. She has a book coming out in the next year. And she says, she has a great TED Talk where she's like, you don't really want me to bring my whole self to work. You want to me to bring the part that's palatable, helpful to you all, right? Stop saying bring my whole self to work, because that's not what you really want. Especially she's a Black woman. I think she's like, no, you're not. That's not what you're really asking. You're asking me to bring the parts that are useful to you. And I think that conflicting message around bring your whole self, but actually not all of it, because we're not quite equipped to deal with the biases we all have against parts of you. I think it puts us all in a really precarious situation.
Completely. No, I do find the way the workplace is changing is fascinating. One of it, I think, is the quick communication that people can now have with friends. So my logic on this was like, when I started work sort of in the late noughties, it was a lot of your side, particularly weekly social life, was made up of the people that you worked with. Whereas now people can kind of communicate much quicker and set up things with their friendship group outside of work, etc. So on Thursday night, etc., people can, go. Whereas it used to be that you used to kind of stay at work late and then sort of go out with people afterwards. But it's that kind of like mentality and how technology is impacting it.
Yeah. Well, and so many relationships are digital, right? Like they're not just mediated by technology. They actually are entirely digital. And and that's true with coworkers too. I get asked that question a lot about the archetypes and getting along, is that how has remote work, the fact that oftentimes we never even hear our colleagues' voices, never mind see their faces, how does that impact?
Yeah.
And I think we've lost a lot of empathy for people because of that, right? We know it is much easier to feel empathy when you look someone in the eye, when you see their face, when you can pick up on their body language. And, I don't feel particularly human when I'm a little box on a screen, never mind just a name in an inbox. So I think it really impacts our ability to develop productive, collaborative, meaningful relationships with our colleagues.
Completely. How do you think that workplace status is changing? So one of the interesting things I'm done or will have been published maybe by the time this comes out, a TEDx talk on what I think, sort of summary of Jimmy's jobs of the future in 150 episodes. And one of the bits of it that I was really thinking about was like, a lot of this stuff comes down to status and the way that kind of status has changed throughout the ages. And even in the 21st century, like, having a BlackBerry was quite a status symbol, etc.
Right.
Like, crazy to think about it, really. Like, that was a good thing.
Right.
Whereas, and like you had to be at a certain level before you got a BlackBerry.
Yeah.
Whereas actually now, like almost the sort of flip is in places and so on. So
I actually when I started work, it was a Palm Pilot. Do you remember the Palm?
no,
Yeah,
no.
it was a precursor to the BlackBerry. It was terrible, but anyway, yes. And that was when you got your Palm Pilot, you had made it. You know?
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, I'd just be, obviously, you write for the Harvard Business Review and think about all these sort of future of work things. I'd just be really interested in any kind of reflections you've got on the status, and because that, it comes down to a lot of it, particularly the tormentor and so on that we were just talking about. It's like a lot of that is kind of a bit of a status game, really.
Yeah, and I think so much. I mean, when you think about, there's a couple of things that come to mind because when you think about status. I'm going to call it status because I can't say status.
No wonder you were looking at me confusingly when I started on that question.
I was like, wait, okay, I know it. I had to translate through my American. I have to say status. I'm sorry, it just doesn't, status doesn't roll off the tongue. But I think one of the things about status is that partly it's driven by ego. And so many of these archetypes are driven by insecurity. And it's about feeding your ego. Political operator, the know-it-all, the insecure managers, the pessimist, as we talk about, sort of this power play. And power and status are different. But I do think there's a sort of desire for status that feeds our ego.
Yeah.
And so I see the other thing I see is that we've democratized status. That's overstating it. But we've really lowered the bar for status through the internet, right? Anyone can become an influencer, right? Anyone. So it doesn't matter your age. You don't have to have a Palm Pilot or BlackBerry. Like all you need is a smartphone and a YouTube channel, and you too can have status, right? And so I think there is a different expectation about how status is gained and who's allowed to have it. That is also laden with a ton of bias, not just generational bias, but gender bias, racial bias. So I think that's really messed up. It used to be clear who had the corner office.
Used to be a bit linear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And who had the corner office, there are all these symbols of it. And now it's not as clear. And sometimes a junior person on a team has really high status because they have special knowledge, because maybe they're, we can get into the whole nepotism thing, right? Then maybe they're connected to the boss in some way, right? There's just, we can't interpret status as clearly. And so I think we end up trying to signal all these different ways we have it, and we sort of try to game the system to get it. Does that resonate with what I'm really curious to see your TEDx talk.
Yeah, well, it was really funny doing it. I mean, they are good. It's a bit like writing when you sort of have to sit and think, right, what do I actually think about all this stuff?
Yeah.
Like it was because one of the things that I've noticed with employment status.
You say status. We'll just speak our own languages here. Yeah.
But in like the early noughties, it was very much, and I'll tell you where it comes from. Partly my thinking on this, but an example of it is Rishi Sunak did the podcast a couple of years ago, and I asked him what job he would be doing now if he were graduating now.
Yeah.
And he said, interestingly, that he thinks he would be doing something in the kind of film, creative, or digital sectors. And this is a guy that in the noughties was a Goldman banker. And I thought that was what everyone wanted to do in the early noughties. And then there was a bit of a shift to kind of technology and a bit of the kind of consulting companies as well. And then in the last few years, it's been a real kind of entrepreneurial, creative kind of thing. And it's just interesting in, quite a short space of time, a couple of decades, how that status of what top graduates go and do has sort of shifted quite a lot. And I think it's only going to kind of continue to change. I don't think we're all going to be running back to kind of be investment bankers anytime soon. And it's just really struck me, and I'm just really interested in kind of what your kind of observations of it. And then that workplace, and I think we haven't worked out post-pandemic yet what workplace status means so much, because like you say, it used to be the kind of corner office or having the best office, and that was always very important in Downing Street, right? The proximity is power thing as well.
Yes.
But so I feel like all these things are still quite up in the air, kind of post-pandemic, and they haven't quite fallen yet.
I have a friend who works for a search firm, and she works remotely, but she went into the New York office, and she had to work with a junior person on the team to actually get something done. And so she said, well, why don't I just sit with you? This office was set up. There were cubicles in the middle of the office, and then there were offices around, right? All the windows were where the sort of higher status people sat. And so she sat in the open cubicles, and apparently the admin of the office got several emails from people saying, why is she sitting there? Could you not get her an office? And in fact, people were walking by saying, why are you sitting here? And I thought, oh my gosh, what a throwback, right? Because
Yeah.
I mean, the office I go to most often is the Harvard Business Review office. There's no offices, right? It's completely open. And I think that's very common for many organizations, especially one that we're not a newsroom technically, but creative organizations where they need to be able to have quick interactions where we're collaborating on the fly. That office is also quite empty these days, which is another interesting phenomenon. But I do think I think about the status of the Wall Street suits, right? The fancy suits, and it's now the most powerful people wear hoodies and T-shirts, right? I actually did a talk in Austin, Texas, where the audio guy had this interesting mic magnet he had developed. So one of the challenges as a female speaker is that I don't often have pockets, or there's nowhere to put the actual I don't know what it's, receptor of the mic or whatever it's called. And so he had developed this whole thing where you could put it on a dress and then sort of connect it in the back with this special magnet. It was actually something he had gotten on Amazon and created. I was so impressed with him. I said, I'm so happy you did this. Do you work with a lot of women? And he goes, no, it's the tech bros, because they want to wear a T-shirt on stage. And I had to figure out, because I couldn't put it on their lapel anymore, but I had to figure out how to actually do it. And I thought, oh gosh, the world has changed, right? It was sad to me that it was not developed for women, but actually for the tech bros. But I benefited.
Yeah, I just find it a kind of a fascinating thing. And I think what you were saying about, socials and people building online followings has become a big way for people to kind of demonstrate status, and I think it's very interesting. It's partly also the breakdown in trust of institutions, right, which is happening kind of like across the board as well in lots of things. And some of it's good, some of it's healthy, some of it's not so much, really.
And again, the note on me is going to say this, even though I don't know for sure, but there's actually an article that we approved a pitch on. So it's not been published yet with Harvard Business Review, about the difference between power and status, in particular the intersection with gender. And I think that's a real new frontier. Again, having read the article, but I do think it's a new frontier in terms of how we think about what matters at work. I think that the difference, and I don't know yet what the difference is, but I do think that difference between power and status and how you gain it and how you expend it, how you spend it in the organization, is going to change the way that we manage. It's going to change the way we interact with one another, and it's going to change careers, to your point.
Completely, because it's understanding that status, what young people want, those incentives and so on, is all changed. But talk to us about Harvard Business Review, because I'm fascinated by it as a kind of as a concept, and as a reader, I think it's it's amazing. I wish we had something a bit more like that in the UK. But talk to us about your job there and your role, and kind of what a week looks like there. Talk us through.
So I'm a contributing editor there, which means I'm very part-time. I don't have a full-time role there, but I've written with HBR since 2008. It's been a while now. So seen the organization evolve quite a bit, although not that much, since it's a 100-year-old organization, right? It's got quite a legacy, and 100 years old is very old in the U.S. Not so much here, but it's a privilege to be associated with it, in that I do feel like we produce incredibly high quality content. We have a web presence. Obviously, we have lots of digital products. We still have the flagship magazine, and then we of course have the press, all the books, and that, including my book, was published with the press there. And it's fun. I sit on the digital team, and we have different topic areas that we can have teams that consider pitches. You'll not be surprised to hear we get so many more pitches than we can ever possibly do anything with. So it's a bit like drinking from a fire hose in terms of people submissions from academics or consultants or, thought leaders, and just trying to really weed through what's new, what hasn't been said, what's a fresh take on something maybe that has been said, who's the right author to talk about that, who has both the experience and the authority and credibility, and then who can write, right? I mean, there's just sort of this constant trying to figure out what's the right thing to say yes to, because we can only say yes to so many things. So I sometimes think of my job there as both exciting in that I get to think about ideas that my fellow editors and I are always talking about what's new, what's coming down the pike, what's interesting. We're getting pitches where it's like, oh, we never thought about that. This is such an interesting piece of research. And then constantly often saying, no, 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 no. We can't accept this, which is, and we say no to some very famous authors just because we can't say yes to everything.
I won't ask you to name the authors, I think it's fair, but give us some idea of some of the pieces that that you get pitched, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's everything from AI. I actually don't sit on the tech team, but AI is, I would venture a guess that half of our pitches have some connection to AI right now. So a lot about AI, of course, the intersection between government or politics and business, especially as this election heats up in the US, I think that's going to be a topic. I sit on the people, we call it the you and your team. So it's about managing yourself, managing your career, managing people. And we get, it can be anything from, the pitch I mentioned earlier about the difference between power and status, or it can be, how do you respond when one of your direct reports won't take your feedback? Right? It can be anything from something very small issue that or I wouldn't even say small, but a narrow issue that a manager or person is dealing with, to some sort of a bigger concept that people are struggling with.
Yeah.
And it's very fun. It's a job like any job. And I think the editors do feel quite overwhelmed a lot, but it's also really fun to just be to sit in a meeting and say, is this new? What else have we done on this? Who else is thinking about this? Let's look at, has the New York Times written anything about this? Just sort of trying to figure out, what the world of ideas is. Just a fun place to be.
Completely. What attributes I appreciate it might not be sort of directly on the hiring team, but taking your knowledge of the you and your team, like what are the kind of skills that are important to work at Harvard Business Review, etc., or just sort of, I know you said you're not a newsroom, but what are the skills that you think are going to be important in the future? Yeah,
I think first and foremost, just sort of curiosity about the world and the world of work. We sort of have an unofficial mission that we want to rid the world of bad management. And so that you have to really be really passionate about finding new ideas, exploring ideas. You have to be, as an editor, you also have to have a discerning eye of like what's actually new, what's something repackaged, what's a lot of BS, right? I think that's another key piece of it. So curiosity, and then entrepreneurialism. I did not say that. Maybe you can say it better. It would sound better if you say it anyway. But I think this idea that you want to build something new, because we're constantly, of course, the bread and butter articles, written articles, but we're doing podcasts, we're doing stuff on socials, we're, developing new products, the toolkits. And so you have to, I think, really also have an entrepreneurial spirit of, are you interested in taking on a new project and developing it from start to finish? I have to say there's two skills that I didn't know I would use as much before I started working. One is negotiation skills. So that process of editing, you're constantly negotiating with the author about what they want to say. How should they say it, especially academic authors who are not used to writing for a lay audience. So it's a constant back and forth with them. And then you're negotiating with the top editor who's giving you feedback saying, no, this is the direction. So it's a ton of negotiation.
Yeah.
And I actually believe negotiation is a skill we don't teach nearly enough. I think we teach it as when you're making a deal, here's how you negotiate, or when you're, deciding on your salary, here's how you negotiate.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't think we teach it enough as like a skill we use every day, all day long. It's just sort of a day-to-day skill. So that's one. And then that entrepreneurial spirit, I would have never said I was an entrepreneur. I would have said I like to be part of an organization. I might have even said, oh, I like to be second in command. And I think one of the things that my work with HBR has really shown me is I love to be part of something new. I love to be on a team collaborating. I co-host our Women at Work podcast, which is it's my favorite project I work on. Love it so much. And it's an amazing team of people saying, again, the world of ideas. What's an interesting idea? What hasn't been said? What do women need to hear right now? How do we balance both what is challenging for women, but also the ways in which we have unique skills? Can we give them hope and not just despair? Those conversations, but then also how do we create a product that people want to listen to? And how do we make sure we're constantly refreshing it so it's not the same thing over and over?
What's the one episode that people should go and check out to sort of start on, rather than just recommending a podcast? I always quite like people saying, go and check this episode out.
I hate this question. I have to be honest.
That's so fair enough. You can give us a couple. But...
No, I'll give you one, but I'll answer it. It's just so, I feel like I only have one child, but I feel like it must be like trying to choose between, I'm like, I love them all. I love this guest. I love that guest. And I'm going to turn it on you actually. But there was an episode about asking for help, with Heidi Grant, who is a social psychologist. She used to be at Columbia. She works in-house at EY now, but she really brought evidence to this idea of how do you ask for help in the workplace, really dispelled a lot of myths, especially about women and asking for help and how it makes us look weak. But which it doesn't actually. Yeah. The research shows it makes us look quite strong and smart to know when we need help. But then also, how do you ask in a way that retains your status, but makes it more likely that the person will help you? So that's one episode. I don't even remember the title, but I will. I'll find it, and we can maybe put it in your show notes. That's one episode I definitely would recommend, and I recommend it. I like all the episodes, but partly it immediately changed the way I behaved. I remember the day after we recorded it, I was asking someone to help me with something, and I wrote the email in a completely different way. So it really changed mine. Okay, what episode of yours would you recommend?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it is.
I know we're on your episode, and your listeners have probably already heard it, but which one is your favorite?
I mean, the 100th episode that we did with a guy called Miles Jacobson, who's the chief executive of Football Manager, which is a video game. And it was fascinating in lots of ways. Partly I'd played the game obsessively as a kid. So I was thinking of 16-year-old Jimmy listening to it. But also what he was saying about jobs and so on, because it now employs 300 people.
Yeah.
And so it's quite a big employer. And he was like, actually, we're not short of computer programmers because everybody people know that Football Manager needs computer programmers. What we're actually short of is people that can construct English narrative arcs and story arcs in the game.
Yes.
And I thought, gosh, that's interesting, isn't it? And I just thought it's funny. Here I am, sort of, 35 at the time, having done all these episodes, and yet still I'm kind of like learning things, and it's really stuck with me. And so much of that episode is about what we're trying to do, which is take those most interesting thought leaders and people running organizations and try and, if we can get that conversation into a 16, 17-year-old who's thinking about their career choices and just thinking, well, I'd love to work at Football Manager and hear all the different jobs at Football Manager, etc. That was, it was just quite interesting from that.
Well, and that's this storytelling as a skill, right? As a job skills. And I think HBR has written quite a lot about that. But as you're talking, I'm like, is that something AI can do? Like, how can AI? Well, I'm sure AI will be able to create stories that are just as compelling and human and connected. But it does feel like such a human skill that I wonder if AI will do it as well.
I think so. I mean, I find where it's useful, AI, for a lot of this stuff is it's quite good at sort of first drafts of stories. And, it can sort of, and particularly it sort of really helps with that kind of like writer's block
Yes.
type thing. Like
Yes.
you can sort of
That's how
chuck
I
in a
use
few
it.
things and it just sort of, and then you're like, okay, that works. And you sort of like change it and so on.
Yeah, and I do find at least so I use it that same way of like, and it's a first draft that I completely rewrite. Like it's like, oh, I now see the thing I don't want to create, which is what what ChatGPT just spit out.
Yeah.
So let me do this instead. But I do notice, and I wonder, I should look into this, but I do notice that often the story it's a bit of a spiral when it's like if I tell ChatGPT, here are my notes for this article I want to write. Please write the article for Harvard Business or whatever. It creates something that at first glance looks like, oh, this looks like an HBR article.
Yes.
But then I get into it and I'm like, oh, the logic is really, it's a spiral. It's not actually an arc, which is what your guest was talking about, where you need someone who can really tell the arc. And I'm sure all Gen AI will get better at that. But right now it feels it just becomes so self-referential and it just loops around. I don't know if I'm making.
No, I completely agree. And it sort of, it uses so many words where aren't required. Like, and it's, I think the sort of, the training models of this type of thing will be interesting. It reminds me a bit sometimes of like when you're first set sort of essays in your teenage years and you're told that it's got to be 800 words or whatever, and you get sort of really obsessive about the 800 figure and like, like trying to like land on it and just using words wherever to sort of, get there. And it's just all a bit kind of like, pointless really.
Yeah.
So like,
Yeah.
it's that skill of, and I think, getting to the point of things is a real sort of, it's going to be a real kind of like skill of the future. I mean, it's always been a skill and so on.
Yeah.
So
one of the fun exercises I've done with, I didn't mean it as an exercise. I asked ChatGPT to write a summary of something. And so I put in the full text, I said, write a summary. And then I wrote, okay, rewrite it with less jargon. And I was like, oh, you don't know what jargon is. Like, it was, and it could not do it. And it just was, and that's, I mean, talk about the role of a HBR editor, really any editor, when you're dealing with someone who has specific knowledge as an author, you're just trying to de-jargon over and over. Like, how can someone who doesn't know this topic understand it? And so far, most of the Gen AI tools I've used have no idea how to de-jargon something.
Yeah.
I think they'll get there, but
I also think it's one of those things of storytelling is like, it is the relation to humans that is so important. And I was thinking this the other day when I was watching something on Netflix. I was like, felt quite rare growing up in the 90s to watch a story that was based on a true story.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now it kind of feels like everything I watch is, based on a true story. And it's just interesting the way that you need that sort of imagination of how that could fall into your life. Yeah, we had the big thing here in the UK, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which has been like a runaway kind of success. But I also watched Baby Reindeer on Netflix in the last couple of weeks. And that, it being based on a true story now feels like, all kind of stories and a lot of what we consume are going to be based on that.
It's such a, do you remember growing up, when it said based on a true story at the beginning of a film or TV, you're like, oh, like and now you just sort of expect that it will be.
Exactly.
I haven't thought about that much. I wonder why that is, if we run out of stories to tell that aren't based in truth.
Well, I think we're so good at kind of finding stories now. Like there's so much information out there that you don't need to make stories up so much. Interesting.
Yeah.
There's a piece somewhere in that. Someone will work it out. ChatGPT will work out what the piece is.
Someone listening, please write it. Thank you very much.
Exactly. I also, on your LinkedIn page, you talked about taking a guilt-free sabbatical.
Yeah.
Talk us through the concept of that. And I'm fascinated by the world of work in terms of how it's changing. You know, Reid Hoffman talks about tours of duty quite
Mm,
prevalently, but I think sabbaticals are going to become even more and more common. But the guilt-free one,
yeah. Well, it had to be guilt-free because I could take time off and just beat myself up the entire time
Yeah.
for taking time off, which is usually my relationship with breaks from work. And I actually think I'm probably better at it than many people, but I think most of us really struggle because particularly in the US, but I think everywhere, there's just this, your worth is measured on what you produce.
Yes.
And I got so deep into that thinking with the book coming out. So it came out September 2022, and writing a book takes, people think the hard part about a book is writing it. And it is hard. I'm not gonna sort of devalue that. But you finish it and then you think, oh, I finished the book. And then you're like, okay, edits. Okay. And then you move into marketing and then, and from September until May of the following year, I felt like I was producing articles, podcasts, social media posts. Like I just was putting so much out, which by everyone else's marker was like, congrats, you're doing a wonderful job. And I was like, I am exhausted.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I need a real break and just a sort of moment. It's actually not Brene Brown. I heard it on Brene Brown's podcast, but it's a woman named Emily Nagoski. I'll look that up too. Who wrote a book about burnout, and she talks about sort of ending the stress cycle. So like stress goes in cycles, and you part of the problem is part of the problem with burnout is you never end the cycle. Like you don't have the negative feeling, let the feeling go, and then move on. You just sort of move right into the next negative feeling.
Yeah.
And so I hadn't heard that interview and then thought, oh gosh, I haven't ended the stress cycle. I just keep going. I keep going. It's been like 3 years with this book. And so I really wanted to take time off. And I kept thinking, oh, I should set some goals for this sabbatical. What do I want to achieve? And then I was like, no, the only goal is to not produce anything. I don't want to produce a social media post, a podcast, an article, anything related to the book. I just want to take in information. I read 15 novels, which was amazing. And just just spent time with family. I traveled. It was really about absorbing as opposed to producing. And I had to call it a guilt-free sabbatical so that I would remind myself it's okay. Like it's okay to take time off. It's okay to rest. It's actually not okay. It's imperative to do it. And I think the problem is we often, I even see myself as I was saying that just now, wanting to say, because it'll make me more productive later. It's like you just keep getting wrapped up in it. And so I'm like, no, I'm really trying to extract myself from that thinking, and it's hard.
Yeah. That is so so true. I think it's partly the modern world thing as well, isn't it? Like you are measured so much on kind of what you produce, the quality of it, etc. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's I have
personal GDP.
Exactly, totally. I love that. You need to coin that term because it is
write that down.
Because I'd find people will say, "Oh my gosh, you're doing so well with your book," or what? And I was like, "No, you're just looking at social media and seeing what I'm putting out there.
Yeah.
I may be doing half of what another author's doing, but I'm maybe doing a better job promoting it."
I get it so much. Like, friends say, "Oh gosh, you're really like smashing it with a podcast," and I do just think, yeah, but it's because you follow me everywhere. You're like getting it, and you're interested in it, like in my kind of like. You're kind of invested in it, so it's sort of asking people where they watch it, and it's hard though that kind of, because of course of course you want to be like wonderful, like
thank you so much,
thank you so much, like we are smashing it, it's like
but what's the measure, right? Like that's and I have to remind myself, and I mean this sounds hokey, but I really mean it, like the measure should be like, do you enjoy doing it? Is it fun to put out in the world? Yes. You want people to listen to it. Of course you want to sell ads, like all of that stuff, so you can keep doing it. But if you don't enjoy doing it every day, like, and that's I like the friends who are like, are you having fun?
Yeah.
Right? Like, oh, how's the book going? Are you having fun with it? That's the question I want people to ask, not like, how many copies did you sell? Like, did you get on so-and-so's podcast? Did you do, it's like, it's just tiring.
Yeah, it's funny. Sometimes people will say, yeah, how many listens have you got or whatever? And it's just funny to kind of flip it back and be like, well, how many do you think? What would I say that would impress you?
Yeah.
Do you think?
That's right.
Like, and it's
Such
just
a good
interesting,
question.
like, yeah, to
Yeah.
kind of like flip it round on that, because I think it's definitely like one of these things that I've found with doing it is it's, I love doing it at the beginning,
Yeah.
and then once you've done a lot of it, it just, like with any sort of new thing, it's just not as exciting as it was at the beginning, but you have
Right.
to find ways of making it so and so on.
It's, this is going to sound very arrogant, but I got asked to do a lot of podcasts, and I've
Mm.
started because for a while I was like, what are the criteria for saying yes or no? And I was having, questions like, how big is their listenership? Is it a target audience I want to reach? All of that stuff. And I've now, and you won't be surprised to hear this given how we ended up here, but is that I'm like, if someone recommends, I do it.
Yeah.
And then I know I will enjoy it, right? And I trusted Helen was like, I think you'll really enjoy this podcast. And I was like, great. Well, it'll be a conversation I'll have fun doing. And, it helped that you had a good number of reviews, and they were almost all 5 stars. Congrats.
We try. But yeah, it's fun. I was talking to someone else about this, talk about like status and whatever. Like when we started out with the podcast, like everyone I knew, I would ask them to kind of rate it, etc.
Yeah.
And but now that's not quite as important. Like that's changed. Like I went and spoke at the school the other day, and I thought I didn't actually say it at the end, and that's a mark of success as well. Is now I don't run around asking people to rate it the entire time. But yeah. If there was somebody, so in terms of Helen almost passing the mic to you, etc. If there's somebody that you think we should interview in terms of you passing the mic on to someone,
there's a couple people. So, number one, there's a woman named Ruchika Tulshian who she actually wrote an incredibly popular article for HBR, one of the most popular articles of the last decade, called "Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome," which I thought was just brilliant. It struck a chord. It was really about how this feeling of not belonging is not really a problem with confidence. It's a problem with the organizational structure.
Okay.
So, and she has a book called Inclusion on Purpose, and she has another book coming out, and you maybe wait till her new book comes out to have her on, called Uncompete. And actually a lot of what I was just talking about around my sabbatical and this pressure to produce and compete on numbers and all that comes from her thinking. So she'd be great.
Yeah. That's interesting.
And the other, that difference between power and status that I was talking about, there's a U.S. professor named Alison Fragale who has a book coming out in September called Likeable Badass, and it's about how we often talk in gender research about women having to balance likability and competence, and she's saying there's no balance. There's just you add them together, and that's the magic recipe. It's I read the book because I got an advance copy, and it's just brilliant. I think she would be a really great guest. And she would be able to really dig in with you about this issue of status that I think you.
All right, let's definitely.
Special. She'll call it status, though. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Well, nice. Now, just one final thing that I didn't ask about. So, tell us the name of the book again, but also, I love this concept of people answering the question about whether they're a good driver. So, just give us this kind of like final spiel on that.
Yes. Oh gosh, I know you honed it on one of my favorite pieces of research. So the book is called Getting Along, How to Work with Anyone, Even Difficult People. And you're referring to the know-it-all chapter. So that one of the things I try to do in each chapter is explain what's a rational reason someone would be a know-it-all or a pessimist or an insecure boss. And for the know-it-all, one of the reasons is because we love overconfidence in people. We just eat it up. And we all tend to be overconfident. So if you ask people if they're a better than average driver, right, 50% of people should say yes, because that would be statistically normal. 75% of people say they're a better than average driver, right? We just think we're better drivers. We think we're better. We're going to get a higher salary than we think we're going to get. We're going to get the job we interviewed for. We tend to be overconfident. And I think it's protective. Actually, it's a nice quality.
Yeah.
The problem is, and this comes from the work of Tomás Chamorro per Music, who taught. He actually wrote another wildly popular article called "Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders?" Which, as in your time in politics,
Yeah.
might ring true. But he talks about that because leadership or managing is not really measurable. We don't have a hard measure for it. We just rely on people to tell us how good they are at it.
Yeah.
So we lost track of competence, and we now just reward overconfidence. And there is a gender component to overconfidence. But truthfully, we all tend to feel overconfident.
Brilliant. Amy, thanks so much for coming on Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. It's been brilliant.
This has been fun. Thank you.